From the time of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, great caves were carved out of the rock in India. While houses and other secular buildings were made of wood and other ephemeral materials, that which was made in service of the eternal was made deep in the heart of the hill. The site of Ellora, on the outskirts of the city of Aurangabad in Maharashtra, witnessed the grand culmination of more than 1,000 years of the rock-cutting tradition. From the 6th century AD till the 10th, the last caves to be made for the Buddhist, Hindu and Jaina faiths were created here. 35 caves were cut out of the western face of an outcrop of the Sahyadri hills. The caves of these faiths were made in overlapping periods, and as everywhere in ancient India, these demonstrate the generous attitude of the rulers towards the worship of all divinities. As in the case of other sites, the caves at Ellora were also created on a trade route. They are on a junction heading from nearby Paitan to Ujjain in central India. One of the earliest excavations here is the Hindu cave 21, called the Rameshwara. This is of the second half of the 6th century. Nandi sits devotedly outside, with his gaze fixed on the Shivalinga in the sanctum inside. The cave has some of the most refined sculptures at Ellora. These include Shalabhanjikas as bracket figures and river goddesses made outside. Larger-than-life scenes depicting Shiva are made in panels, including this, which shows Shiva and Parvati engaged in a game of dice. In the Indian tradition, the deities are made in a human manner. There are depictions of their family life and emotions. This makes the devotee's experience of them more immediate and real. The deities are, after all, personifications of ideas and qualities which are in each of us. The cave has one of the finest depictions of the Nataraja, Shiva, in his cosmic dance. With both knees bent, the figure is imbued with dynamic movement, yet it is fluid and graceful. And with all the movement around, the face conveys a sense of stillness and sublime peace.
The continuity of life, in fact, the continuity of reality, is a theme that is directly addressed in Indian mythology as well as Indian sculpture. It is perceivable, perhaps, if you go to the great caves at Ellora and go from cave to cave and narrative icon to narrative icon and look at the small details, at the ganas of Shiva who are rollicking at the feet of the scene, playfully doing sometimes naughty things, playing games, playing jokes, all sorts of observations of what might seem to be the trivia of life, but which are the fabric of life.
Cave 29 of the late 6th century is similar in plan to the Great Shiva Cave at Elephanta. The scale is vast, and the effect of the sculpted panels of Shiva is dramatic. The Buddhist caves at Ellora were made in the 7th century. These are the largest Buddhist excavations to be carried out in India. They reflect developments in iconography which had been taking place. From the simple ethical messages of the original teachings, the doctrine had become much more detailed. The qualities required for enlightenment had been studied in great detail, and these had been personified in a large number of deities. A graded path towards the truth had been evolved. Deities who personified the attributes of wisdom and compassion of the Buddha had been created. The devotee meditated upon these to fully imbibe the quality personified and became the deity himself. He would then proceed further on the illumined path towards the peace at the center. The last Buddhist Chetyagraha, with the stupa to be excavated, is Cave 10 at Ellora. The stupa has all but disappeared behind the figure of the Buddha, which has become much larger than it was at Ajanta in the 5th century. The traditional large window of the Chaitya Hall has also undergone considerable change. It has lost its vast size and grand simplicity to become smaller and more decorative. Meditation and worship was now conducted in the vast interior of the Buddhist viharas. The caves are larger and more elaborate than ever undertaken before. Cave 12 has 3 vast stories, each larger than any Buddhist excavation at earlier caves at Ajanta. The caves have many representations of previous Buddhas called Manushi Buddhas and Dhyani Buddhas, who represent qualities of the Enlightened One. Bodhisattvas are also made. They are beings on their way to enlightenment who help others on the path. With Cave 14, we move into the realm of Hindu deities. Magnificent panels are carved on the walls of the 8th century cave. These depict Shiva, Durga, Vishnu and Lakshmi. Shiva, performing the cosmic dance as Nataraja, holds us spellbound. The twist of the waist and the swing of the arm convey the vigor and dynamic energy of the divinity beyond the world of mortal forms. Cave 15 of the middle of the 8th century has some of the finest and most expressive carvings at Ellora. The cave has 2 floors, of which the upper one has magnificent sculptures. The left wall has depictions of Shiva made with a dramatic intensity. Here, he kills the demon Antkasura. There are also depictions of Lord Vishnu, such as this, where, as part man and part lion, he kills the demon Hiranyakashipa. The grand climax of rock-cut architecture in India is in Cave 16, the Kailashanatha Temple. This was excavated in the reign of the Rashtrakuta king Krishna I, who ruled from 757 AD to 793 with his capital at nearby Paitan. This is the largest and most magnificent excavation of the world.
The Kailasana Temple at Ellora in Maharashtra is really one of the great unsung wonders of the ancient world. This magnificent Kailasana Temple, or Cave 16, is the single largest monolithic excavation in the entire world. Imagine a colossal sculpture of a multi-storied temple hewn out of a single piece of rock, which is really twice the area of the structural Greek temple of the Parthenon. And that is essentially what the Kailas is.
The entire hillside has been transformed into a great temple, with structures carved both inside and out. The scale is breathtaking. From the courtyard, the temple rises over 100 feet.
The construction of this cave shrine was an extraordinary feat of human genius. It involved the removal of some 200,000 tons of rock, and it would have taken some 100 years to complete. It is estimated that some 2 million cubic feet of rock were cleared to make way for the Kailasana Temple.
In concept, the Kalashanatha is similar to the smaller, unfinished Vattuvankovil temple of the Pandyas at Kalugumalai. The two are contemporaneous. The Kalashanatha is made in the South Indian style and has many similarities with the Virupaksha temple at Pattadakkal of a few decades earlier.
Apart from, of course, the expertise in carving shrines and cave temples at Ajanta itself in the local volcanic trap rock, going back to about 2nd century BC, in the conception of this Rashtrakuta monument at Ellora, one can see the influence coming from the Pallava domain of executing freestanding monolithic shrines. Of course, the Pallavas were working with very hard and intractable granulite, whereas the rock at Ellora itself had some advantages for permitting this kind of monumental monolithic excavation, because it consists of amygdaloidal trap rock, which is actually full of porosities and not as dense as granite, which makes it actually a lot easier to carve. And at the same time, its compressive strength is almost as good as granite. So it's actually an ideal material for this kind of rock cut excavation.
The courtyard goes 276 feet into the heart of the rock and is 154 feet wide. At the back, the vertical drop from the hillside is 120 feet. The planning of the excavation had to be extremely sophisticated, as it depended upon what was cut and removed rather than what was added, as in conventional architecture.
So they would have probably begun by clearing out a vast field at the top of the cliffside, going to the top of the pinnacle of the Vimana, and then they would have laid out in quite elaborate detail all the measurements and the plans for the temple on this vast level field. And they would have probably progressed by taking certain grids, probably of about 6 feet cube at each time, so that the excavators could just stand and carve out the various portions without any need for scaffolding as they worked. And they'd have used rock bridges along the way to connect and to clear out the debris. And they'd have progressed from the back of the conceived monument to the front, clearing away that way, and then from the top to the bottom.
In the manner established by now in South Indian temples, the Kalashanatha is made in 4 basic units. There is a high entrance gate or gopuram, which screens the sacred space from the outside world. Next is a shrine of the bull which Shiva rides, Nandi. Here at Ellora, we also have 2 monolithic towers flanking the Nandi shrine. They would have originally carried the trident symbols of Shiva. On both sides are also made life-sized elephants. In keeping with well-established tradition, is seen the goddess Lakshmi, lustrated by elephants. She signifies the fertility and prosperity of the natural world and has been seen in all religious edifices in India since the 2nd century BC. Beyond the Nandi shrine is the vast and looming volume of rock, which contains the large mandapa or hall of the temple and the main shrine. The tower made over the sanctum rises to a height of 96 feet from the courtyard floor. At the base, the shrine is supported on the backs of life-sized elephants. This is a tradition which began from the Buddhist caves of Atalora in the 2nd century BC. The temple is made on 2 levels. The Nandi Mandapa, the main hall, and the shrine are elevated from the floor of the courtyard. This level is reached by stairways on either side of the assembly hall. This heightens the sense of the sacred and of wonder in the devotees. After having come into a world created out of the heart of the mountain, they now ascend to a more sanctified height. The main temple complex is so magnificent that the excavations and reliefs in the side walls do not receive the attention they deserve. Among the masterpieces of the Kalashanatha sculpture is the depiction of Ravana shaking Mount Kailasha. He is made fully in the round and is seen in a dramatic, deeply shadowed setting. With his multiple arms spread dynamically about him, he attempts to violently shake the mountain. Above, the emotion of Shiva's spouse Parvati is expressed as she fearfully clutches his arm. Her maid is seen fleeing into the background, creating an effect of expanding space where there is actually only rock behind. Calmly and fully in control, Shiva merely presses down his toe to imprison Ravana under the mountain below. The scene expresses the unlimited power of true knowledge. The entire temple was originally plastered and painted on the inside and outside. Today, only a few paintings survive on the ceiling of the mandapa, displaying the traditions continuing from earlier Western Indian caves. Fragments of plaster and colour on the outer surfaces show at least 3 layers of paintings which were made over the centuries. A contemporaneous copper plate inscription states that the architect of the temple stood before its grandeur in amazement and said, "Was it indeed I who built this?" The record goes on to say that the gods who passed above the temple in their celestial chariots could not believe that it was the work of mere mortals. The 9th century Ellora saw the making of Jaina caves. Cave 30 is called Chota Kailasha, as it is a much smaller version of the grand Kalashanatha Temple. The profusely decorated pillars are among the finest seen anywhere. The Puran Ghatas, or the vases of plenty, out of which they rise, are a continuing motif in Indian art from the 1st century caves of Betsa. The veranda has figures of Matanga, who represents prosperity, and Siddhaika, who represents abundance and generosity. The figures are made in fine detail. The cave has representations of the Jaina Tirthankaras, Mahavira, Parsavnatha and Gomteshwara. In penance and meditation, Gomteshwara is believed to have stood still for so long that creepers grew around his legs and body. In the 10th century, a colossal statue of Gomteshwara was made out of a large rock at Shravanabelagola, further south in present-day Karnataka. Surviving murals on the ceiling of the cave are very valuable, as they mark the beginnings of the stylized medieval idiom in Indian paintings. Cave 33, known as the Jagannatha Sabha, is similar to Cave 32. These caves mark the end of the great tradition of rock-cut temples in India. For 1200 years, sanctuaries were hewn out of the rock. These took us far from the clamour and anxieties of the material world outside. Deep in the heart of the mountain, the devotee could meditate upon symbols and personifications of the finest qualities within each of us. The aim was to come out of oneself with the realization of the grace which is in all of creation.